at Deakin, but still linked in with the staff there in the Faculty of Science, Engineering and Built Environment. Here's what I get when I do a Google search for engineering, and that's the first few results. In my kind of experience anyway, there are certain preconceptions about the practice of engineering, and I think some of them are on display here in what you see here. When I looked at the searches, I came up with a sort of list of blueprints, cogs, hard hats, circuit boards, and various unidentifiable thingatrons. And similarly, here's the first few results. If you search for science, and I could see some molecules, some DNA, glassware containing strange unidentified colored liquids, microscopes and brains. And so when I do something like this, I wonder, is this really representative of the practice of engineering science, particularly in Australia? And that's our interest, and I'll explain why shortly. Also, Karen and myself are heavily involved, or were, and Karen still is, in the provision of work integrated learning opportunities for students in the engineering and science and other technology-related programs at Deakin University. So we kind of do it from an enthusiastic but also a critical perspective, and maybe reflective is maybe a better way, but it's also a very pragmatic perspective as well. So to us, there are quite valid and valuable, if you like, critiques about the impact of will. So you see a lot of simple correlational research that looks for links between participation in will and various outcomes, but often does that simplistically and isn't able to or doesn't look for confounding variables that perhaps might explain some of what you see. And certainly there's some evidence that students who are able to participate in will, particularly if it's an unpaid internship, are those that are already financially well off or well connected socially or have professional networks. And so I guess we do look at the practice of will with a critical reflective perspective. Similarly with the idea of generations, when we went looking for a good firm definition of when the dates of the various generations might start, we didn't find one, but we did choose one, and you'll see it later. But also, if you look in the literature around the idea of generations, it's almost impossible to disambiguate generations idea from concepts of age anyway, the differences between younger people and older people, and the influences of contemporaneous events. You only have to think of the impact of COVID-19. It would be impossible to, remove the influence of that event from students of a particular age. But, we accept certainly that our university, our faculty, and many others internationally are committed to will, so there is a need to do it well. Likewise, while we might be critical of the generational idea, we in fact find that a generational lens offers a very useful way for us to contextualize the findings in our research. So like I said, we had a bit of trouble pinning down firm start dates, but there's the ones we picked from, if you like, moderately reputable sources. Having said that, if you change those around a couple of years either way, it doesn't really change much of what I'll present shortly. Just wanted to give a bit of context. In Australia, conventional in age for university is 18 or 19 years for undergraduate programs. Obviously, there's many students come to university older than that, and a few younger that I have seen. Bachelor courses, generally 3 to 4 years in length. The ones that were longer are now largely master's courses. So if we take that generational lens, that's actually provides quite a useful concept for us to work with. So for us in Australia, Generation Y, those that have been in the last decade or so coming to university and by now have almost all graduated. And so I'll mention later on, we're very interested in this group. What can their experiences tell us that would inform what we do for current students and those that are to come, if you like, Generation Z. So those who are now studying, a few of them have recently graduated, and many of them are still on the way to university. So that's some sort of context and parameters around what we'll be talking about. The faculty context, CB, we call ourselves, Science, Engineering and Built Environment at Deakin. University in Australia has a large number of students from pre-undergraduate to coursework, research, masters, PhD, and a lot of industry programs as well. Our faculty has approximately 12,000 students. 2019 and 2020, in both years, about 1,300 students completed some form of WIL subject, so that's WIL for credit. Biggish numbers, and where I keep saying where the faculty is in the process of moving from what was previously limited compulsory WIL in subjects to now most programs having 4 credit compulsory core subjects in work integrated learning. So those numbers will grow over time. The faculty's made a large commitment to WIL, invested significant money and time in staff and people, and as I said, made it compulsory for students in most programs. So some historical developments in Australia in engineering. Traditionally, there was a 12-week work experience requirement. That was for the professional body. Most programs took that into, most engineering programs made that a requirement for graduation. So that was there in our engineering programs, and one of the environmental science programs had a field work placement elective, which I have to say was quite popular with students, but it was only elective and only in one of the science programs. For science generally in Australia, it's not professionally accredited, so there's no external requirement for WIL or anything really. And so historically, the opportunities for WIL have depended on the philosophy of the science program. Our faculty also had architecture, building and IT, and historically those programs had no specific 4-credit WIL opportunities. And of course, all of the WIL subjects situated within schools and programs and disciplines were discipline-based. So WIL is generally considered to be an important contributor to graduate employment success, but where do graduates in engineering and science actually work in Australia? Well, we have something, at least one source that we can turn to. The Australian census, conducted every 5 years. It's as close as you can get to an exhaustive survey of the 25 odd million people. And the last 3 censuses from 2006, 2011, 2016 are online and publicly available. So you can query collectively, not obviously you can't get results for individual people, but records highest qualification, the respondents list, and also their current occupation. So it is possible to cross-tab people who have certain undergraduate degrees and have a look at collectively where they're working. In CB, 2 largest courses are engineering and science, and they have the longest involvement with work integrated learning. So that was the particular focus here for us. I'm an engineer by first degree, so that's my interest. For many years involved in the program at Deakin, and the WIL group in the faculty have been working with science as well over time. So we're particularly interested in those 2 groups in the first instance. Having a quick check of the time, I'll keep it moving along. So here's some results from the census, and I'll just focus on the 2006 columns, but you can see the results are kind of generically the same between the three census groups. So on the left-hand side, there's Bachelor of Engineering graduates, and on the right-hand side, Bachelor of Science graduates in Australia. And this first little block that I've highlighted yellow indicates the proportion of graduates. And keep in mind, this is, when I say graduates, this is all graduates, not just recent graduates. But it is possible to further cut this by age and make some assumptions about the age of recent graduates and get a picture of recent graduates. But this is all. So you can see 30% of engineering graduates were working in what you would call a professional engineering job, occupation, and in science, while you don't strictly talk about professional science roles, the census lists roles which are clearly analogous, so have science in the name. So it was about 15% in 2006, working elsewhere, otherwise employed, and not working. And so that includes people who've left the workforce, retired, people who are looking for work, people involved in further study. And you can disaggregate that. And across the top, those little numbers shaded in grey are the total number of respondents. So you can see over the last decade, from 2006 to 2016, there's been a large number, significant increase in the number of people listing Bachelor of Science or Bachelor of Engineering as their highest qualification. Some of that will be skilled migration into Australia, but a lot of it is the large increase in the number of enrolments in those particular disciplines. So if we look at that group in the middle and expand that further, here's 2016 census numbers for engineering. So there's the 25 in the top right-hand side who are in engineering, the 23.5 at the top of the bar who are not working, and that other group in the middle, otherwise employed, split up a bit further, again, based on indication in the census of the occupation of the respondent. So you can see engineering graduates are kind of working in quite a lot of roles that have nothing to do with professional engineering. You can take a similar cut for science. It's a slightly older one that I had to hand from the 2011 census, but you can see again, science graduates in particular, only less than 15% are working in a clearly defined sort of professional science occupational role. There's a group, about a quarter, not working, and then the rest are working elsewhere in a number of sectors. So we might conclude, or certainly I conclude, that these kind of generic pictures that you get associated with those two professional groups, occupational groups, not particularly reflective of where our graduates are working. Conversely, you can look at it the other way. So you can take who indicated they were working in a particular occupation, and so we've done it here for professional engineering roles and the analogous science roles, and then look at the highest qualification they list. So this first one, again, engineering on the left, science on the right, sorry. So those people working in a professional engineering role, less than half of them listed a bachelor qualification as their highest degree. There is a small group who have a higher qualification in engineering, so a master's and a PhD, but a significant group, nearly half for both engineering and science, do not have a cognate, if you like, undergraduate bachelor degree. So that was a doubly interesting finding for us. in Australia, engineering is relatively professionalised, but unlike architecture, medicine, and some other disciplines, does not have legal protection for the occupational title. So it means that people with other backgrounds can call themselves an engineer. So if I take just the data from 2016 for engineering and science, and stack up those who've got a qualification, a bachelor degree in engineering and science, and those working in professional engineering role, there's a couple of things hopefully you can see here. One of the first things I noted is that there are many more bachelor graduates than there are professional roles for both engineering and science. So that's quite profoundly important, I think, for the start. That blob down the bottom here, on the left-hand side, it's those with the qualification working in a professional role, and going back the other way, those in a professional role who've got a bachelor qualification. So comfortingly, those two blocks lined up. So that gives us some confidence in what we're seeing in the census data. But there is this big difference between the two, and in both cases, it's heading towards 50%. So in both cases, there's almost twice as many people with a bachelor qualification than there are professional roles in the workplace. So I think that's quite an important thing to think about if you're worried about where your graduates are working. So traditional view of will, it's an opportunity to apply discipline-specific knowledge. And there's a quote from a colleague I know well, Kelvin Smith. He called it the nexus between the canonical knowledge of discipline and constituents of professional practice. We would argue that what's needed is a broader conception of will. So given the occupational outcomes from the census from the last decade, we say that if will placements are going to be an accurate representation of graduate practice, they need to encompass options for context beyond only engineering and science workplaces. Those will be important, of course. So in CB, from 2006 onwards, we offered elective will placements for credit, particularly for those courses and programs and schools where there was no will option. As we said, many of those courses have now moved to a mandatory will placement. But those will electives still exist. So there's one industry-based learning one, which is an opportunity for students to take a placement for credit in their discipline. But we also offer what we call a career placement. So it's a placement for will in any relevant area that the students can make a case for.
2 minutes left, Stuart.
Excellent. Coming on to the home stretch. So the assessment for both of those are essentially the same. And they involve a number of elements, and you can see them there. Pre-placement development of goals, completion of periodic work logs, and a presentation at the end about the activities completed, placement evaluation that involves input from all the stakeholders, including the placement hosts, and the students reflecting on their skills. So throughout those things, there's a focus on the kind of the metacognitive connection between learning, developing capacity, and workplace performance. And these different elements of the assessment kind of exercise different modes of reflective practice. Academic staff and industry supervisors both contribute to the summative assessment of these tasks. In 2018 and 19, both years, about 100 students enrolled in one of the STP subjects, and a quarter of those were in 341. That's the out-of-field placement for credit. Interestingly, even though we never advertised it outside the faculty, a number of students from outside our faculty enrolled in STP 341 seeking an out-of-field placement. So there is demand for out-of-field placement, and it's not just in our faculty. And that was completely unexpected. So for us, viewing placement will in STEM disciplines through the lens of generational cohorts gave us a valuable and productive approach for thinking about this. We looked for evidence of where Generation Y, those who've been at university in the last decade or so, where they're actually working, and use that to inform our thinking about how we're going to best prepare Generation Z students, those at university now and still to come. We found the census was one useful source of information in doing that. So certainly our approach, and what we'd argue, is there needs to be a broader view of placement-based will and what constitutes a valid setting for students in which to undertake the will practice. So given a bit of a whirlwind presentation of one approach to how we achieve that in our faculty, which is, I got to say, very conventional and conservative. We kind of snook around them by offering it as an elective, and so students are free to take those electives, and the evidence is they are. And I guess just as a postscript, COVID-19 has rapidly changed people's thinking about what was possible, even just a few months ago, and we think that's a change for the good, and we hope it will be for good, forever from now on. And we're about to, in the next few months, undertake our 2021 census. So we're going to have a whole new set of data to have a look at, but we really don't expect any radical changes in what our graduates are doing. So thank you very much for your time. And certainly if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. That was really interesting. And I've got a couple of questions here, but I want to make sure there's time for other people to ask questions as well. So yep. Those of you with questions, I'd ask you to come on the camera and use your microphone. The recording is still going, just so that everyone knows. So if I ask a question to start off, Stuart, I know you talked about using reflection in your assessments, and I know that's something that students quite often can struggle with, even though it's really, really useful. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you make sure that that reflection is productive, and how do you prepare them for reflecting on their work integrated learning?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. So if the first place that students hit a reflective exercise is in their final year of their study on their work placement, then that's not a good thing, and it still does happen. But we've over the years now worked with all of the schools in the faculty about building, if you like, scaffolding capacity for when they come to this task. And so that involves getting reflective activities into assessment earlier in the program. And in fact, while most of the schools, most programs now have their own core will placement, so that means students still coming to these elective subjects in addition to having completed a mandatory will requirement already. So there is a strong interest from students in taking additional placements. What we've been able to do is, over time, mould the assessment in those within discipline mandatory will experiences to also be the same. So that was a big win. Took a lot of work, but basically all of the will subjects across the faculty now have that model of assessment. In that, that might help us, but it doesn't change the situation that a student may come across a reflective exercise. It's about, I guess, modeling what's required. So we provide sample model, if you like, submissions. And there is, I didn't mention it, but there is a mandatory pre-placement online preparatory subject as well, that not only covers things around occupational health and safety and conduct in the workplace, but also deals with the assessment, the details of the assessment that the students will be required to complete. So it does bridge and broach that topic of reflective practice. I just had a few dot points there, but in most cases, those activities are in fact multi-stage. So there's a kind of formative aspect to the assessment as well, where the students have a chance to get some feedback from industry and academic partners, and then there's a summative assessment at the end.
Yeah, brilliant. I love the feedback from industry and academic partners. That's fantastic. Paula, did you have a question? I can see you've come on your camera.
Yeah, I did actually. And I think I have several, but I won't do that triple-barreled question for you, Stuart. But the one that's most pressing is you said that some of the aspects of COVID represented to you a change for the good. What exactly does that mean for the programs that you're talking about?
Yeah, so in last year in 2020, more than 80% of the student placements in the STP units were remote. So that's something that's never happened before. There's been a little bit of it in IT, where that's perhaps a more natural setting for students to work with technology remotely anyway. But almost overnight, and certainly in a matter of a few weeks, the vast majority of the placements had to be converted to not in industry settings, because they were simply not available in Australia with the widespread lockdowns that we had here. People were not at work. It was only last week that I went back to the office for the first time in more than 13 months. There's been a period of where there has been no industry setting for a lot of students. So that was a lot of very quick pivoting of approaches for all parties, but it's been very successful. It's opened a lot of people's eyes, and I think both in terms of, well, I think what it's done is broadened a lot of people's horizons as to what is a valid industry placement, how it might be conducted, and so I think we've got a bridgehead to start a wider conversation about this idea of will placements in science and engineering should really be contemplating a wider range of disciplinary settings. Yeah.
Thank you.
Please, did you have a question? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I did. No, I just wanted to follow on that actually, Stuart. So I'm the joint program lead with Paula on the B2B sales apprenticeship program. And I think, there are definitely pros and cons in that virtual work integrated placement, because in sales, it's such a social profession that for our apprentices, it's been harder, I think, for them to learn when they're on their own in a room without listening to what's happening in the business around them. And I think when it comes to, I guess, across all disciplines, it's how you can still manage that learning from your peers and learning from your team to make sure there's some kind of social situations that can be supported for those placements. I think that's just something that we've very much been seeing.
Yes, yes.
I just wanted to share that.
And look, I imagine that probably the majority of the placements will go back to physical placements once circumstances permit. But I really hope that for those students that a remote placement would work better, or it provides the only opportunity that they've got. Then there's a wider willingness to contemplate that, and that we've now got sort of mechanisms that support that well.
Yeah, no, it shouldn't preclude it, but you just need to make sure there's support mechanisms in place.
Yes, yeah. I started a new role at the start of this year, and I'm just, I count my blessings every day that I had at least 3 months before I got sent home for a year. We've had a number of people start, remotely since, and I do wonder, how they've travelled over the last 12 months, how they've settled into work, how they've, been able to develop their social and professional groups, and I fully appreciate it. May have been very difficult in some circumstances.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm just conscious of time, and I don't want to chew into Paula's time. So I can see there's lots of discussions to be had. So I'd suggest that we make use of the coffee space at the end of the presentations. Although it'd be quite late there for you, Stuart, but that's okay. And I'm going to hand over now to Paula Nottingham for her presentation.
So Elizabeth, if I share my screen.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Paula, do you want me to keep recording or do you want me to stop the recording now?
Oh, we can record it. That's fine.
Totally up to you. So if you're happy, I'll keep the recording going.
Okay.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you.
How about that? And can I just ask a quick question? Can you see the images or just the slides?
I can just see the slide at the moment. I can see the slide and you.
Okay, brilliant. Fantastic. I'm just going to do that so I can see better. Hi, everybody. My name is Paula, Dr. Paula McIver, Nottingham, and I'm very happy to be with you today to share the chapter that I have in this book. I believe it is chapter 8. And I'm from Middlesex University, and the chapter's name is Designing Work-Based Learning Approaches for Generation Y and Generation Z and Beyond. And it's basically a case study, which I'll explain as we go, but what I'm really interested in is designing pedagogy with active engagement. We're lucky enough to have a co-program leader with us today as well. But my history has been with work-based and work-integrated learning. And I was very interested in seeing how that actually works with younger generations. So there's a principle here to include active engagement in what we do. So the chapter and the case study gave me an opportunity to look at those issues in a new way. So to explain the case study, the program that I work on is called the BSc Honors Professional Practice in Business Sales. And it's at Middlesex University, and I'm a program leader and a tutor on the course. My overriding interest in doing this was to look at how younger learners worked with not only content, but also the work-based properties of what they were doing in the program. My own research has been in the idea of redefining and innovating in work-based learning. The program also carried through during the COVID period, and the research was done during this period. So there's a little aspect of that here in some of the findings, which I found very interesting as well. So very briefly, the context, Middlesex University is in the west of London, and it's been having work-based learning for quite some time. It has a reputation for doing so. Our partners in the program are Consalia, and I would note that they are growing every day. And I go to the website and look at new titles, but I've gotten the Sales Business School here as one of their newest initiatives. We have some wonderful students. There's some representative photos on the right there. And our degree apprentices are sales professionals. Well, they are apprentices, and a lot of in positions such as account managers, but they work in a number of different organizations. And I haven't actually named those employers today. And when I did get information from the apprentices / students, those were anonymized as well. So that's not in today's presentation, but be aware that, you know, it can be fantastic to have a lot of different organizations, but can also be challenging because everyone's in a different work environment. My own background is in professional practice, and I studied lifelong learning, which is based on personal, social, and economic features. So learning in the workplace has always been a part of what I've studied. Very quickly, there's many background trends and legacies with work-based learning. And I've just put a few, and there are more in the chapter there to give you some sort of background in this type of work. We concentrate on working knowledge. The expansion of degree apprenticeships is a part of what's going on today in the UK. We are seeking that connectedness between the academic study and the workplace learning. And yes, apprenticeships are perhaps a way of investing in a sustainable higher education practice. There's, as I mentioned, a very large legacy of work-based learning. There's some authors there on the right to give you some examples there in the chapter, but it is a very interesting field. And so we haven't just started from the get-go, we have a lot of research in the field that can help us in the job that we now have to do. However, I was really interested in using the ideas of Generation Y and Generation Z to look at these younger learners, because I was working with people who were younger than I had worked with in previous years. And I actually went to McCrindle, that some of you might be familiar with, to get my timings on the generations. Stuart mentioned that there are lots of different timings, and I put a few other ones there at the bottom of the slide. But I really liked these, and I liked the way that McCrindle talked about the generations and looked at their what they were within the generation. So these are the ones that I used: Generation Y, 1980 to 1994, and Generation Z, 1995 to 2009. And of course, we have Alpha coming through the system. So in the chapter, I went over a little bit of literature to really become acquainted with what the ideas for Generation Y and Generation Z are. So yes, they probably do have some things in common with each other because they've grown up at the same time, having some of the same experiences. They actually agree that they have responsibility for their own learning, and alike face-to-face learning experiences. They like real experiences. Generation Z is somewhat different. They do like a collaborative working. They have grown up in a world that's far more diverse, and they may respond to authority a little bit differently. Their main features are social altruistic, which means that they do want to contribute to society and work. They may actually have a few different expectations with seamless technology, perhaps with a little less attention span being online. And, but they did prefer environments with experiential learning opportunities and mentoring, which works well with the way that we provide tuition in the B2B sales program. But it's worth saying that it's, I think most people who work in education don't like to just stereotype particular individuals or particular cohorts. So I also looked at some of the literature that gave a kind of an overview. For example, reframing graduate attributes as values, intellect, social engagement, and performance. And this could be true of any cohort in any demographic. Considering the managerial approach and questioning that because it could be problematic. So, you know, framings that, for example, associated Generation Y with a particular stereotype, you know, narcissistic, for example, may not be actually true to form. All the generations have leadership ambition. So it's not just the people up and coming. It's not just the older generations, but everybody has that. And I really like this one about the centrality of teacher caring. So in an academic environment, providing the basics, especially with Generation Y and Generation Z, could be very, very important. And linking the learning with the social world and popular culture with that particular demographic. So the case study that I carried out very briefly about the B2B sales was really quite basic. I was just trying to find out about what we did and looked at how these factors might actually inform our practice. Practitioners find it very hard to do research. We're usually very, very busy creatures. So I think it's very valuable to have practitioners also doing research about what they do. So there's aims and objectives, very, very basic, find out what was there, but also to theorize and to learn more about this younger generation of learners. So basically for this very, very brief case study, I did look at the learning resources as a program leader. So I looked at our curriculum, our coursework, my experience. There's plenty more there, and there's plenty of things to research after this case study. But we did have quite a lot up. And as Stuart mentioned, during the COVID period, a lot of things had to go online. So we had to look at things anyway, really, to see what we were providing. Our partner Consalia has a philosophy for sales, and they are our sales specialists. So we did use that philosophy while we were studying, because that is the content of the course. And we have timelines that we keep. So again, that virtual learning platform that we hold did have to be reviewed and revised during the period. I also did a Qualtrics questionnaire that was very brief. I sent it to 91. I got 12 responses just to give me some data. And actually I got more data than I really needed, even for this short exercise, but it was really, really interesting, something that I would like to do more of. But it was exploratory. It did not necessarily represent the whole cohort. So findings, thematically, again, in the chapter, far more detail, but in the first one, I really enjoyed this one. This has to do with those surprising results. Basically, yeah, people knew what they were and if they were Y or Z, but it didn't matter. You know, people said, this is just me. And that resounded with the literature. You know, people said, yes, I know I'm a Y or a Z, but it doesn't matter. I'm just me. I've had the experiences I've had. How do I know anything different? And I think every generation would say this. I really found that fantastic common ground. So I might be a different generation, but we all have that in common. Our generation Y did see themselves as mature learners, and our generation Z felt that they were the same age as other university students. But beyond that, you know, it really doesn't matter. Common ground. The other thing that was quite surprising was I didn't actually ask any technology questions, and yet I got technology responses, because this particular age groups, these two age groups, have a lot of experience online. They've used social media, they've used the web for a long time, especially Generation Z. Generation Z, as one of the respondents said, was born into the digital age. And they actually preferred it. They're really good online. And during the COVID period that we had, in terms of the research, people actually had to do even more online. So some people even preferred to have things online because they could negotiate them better. You know, gone were the days of going into a library and picking books off a shelf. Most of the Middlesex University materials are actually online, and we are a green university. So that kind of fed in well with the way that we do our program. Integration of communication and social selling. So people felt like this understanding of going online and working online, and their experience actually worked with the content of what they were doing on the course. They actually take some of the modules that have to do with social selling, digital selling as a part of the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that they're required to have. So they felt like this was working with them in terms of not only learning, but also embedding that into their workplace practice, which is very good. And they were very aware of what they were doing and how they were doing it. Sometimes being a younger professional led to people sort of saying that they didn't have the experience required, or that they were at the beginning of their, professional life. But other than that, mainly that use of online was much appreciated by employers and customers. In the learning, people did bring it back to the way that they personally did things, a level of personal touch. But it was a bit different, perhaps, than some of the other people that they worked with. So Generation X, for example. So they were aware that, the way that they worked was somewhat different than others in the workplace. That awareness was not necessarily a negative awareness, but it was there. Some people talked about a tribal knowledge in sales. So yes, slightly different experience here with COVID because people were online, but there's a lot of experience in organizations, especially in sales. And so one of the jobs that an apprentice is required to do is sort of try to investigate that and even do projects surrounding some of that experience. So that was quite interesting as people were building into that. and different approaches to working to previous generations. Yes. What this might lead to is just taking that on board, because they're aware that there are differences, but what do we do about them? So we looked at the flexibility of the degree apprenticeship, and just to see if people were happy with that. And generally people had a very good level of engagement. There were a lot of challenges that we came up against. Some people felt it was a different type of university experience. And we also had some very good employers, and they did provide a lot of that support that the literature talked about in terms of being in the workplace and having a pattern for people to learn and take the learning that they were getting in the apprenticeship into their workplace practice. So they were providing things like extracurricular projects and chances to work with other teams than sales teams. Stuart was just talking about that in terms of a wider skill set for graduates. And I did actually ask about COVID because people were right in the midst of it. We certainly had a lot going on at the university, and down below you see a picture of a pre-COVID session that I did not present, but I was able to attend. And it has been said earlier in the literature that people did appreciate those in-person, face-to-face experiences. But anyway, what I would say is motivation, morale, we did have to work with that all the way through this. And this generation was not just sitting by, they started WhatsApp groups, they came to sessions, we had more sessions on, and they came to those sessions for the most part. It was sometimes quite difficult. However, it did also allow people to kind of shine because they were the ones who knew about this technology, went on the technology. And so they felt a bit empowered during this period because they were the ones that people looked to be able to go into a Zoom or to do that WhatsApp and to be able to do it with that seamless property that maybe an organization hoped for with customers. So eye openers, really nice. Apprentices do know what, they know their groups, but it doesn't matter. We have common ground. There are lots of positive attitudes about technology, and people do want a work-life balance. They want to be able to really give at work. They don't want to just sit on the sidelines. For the most part, our input from employers has been really well informed, consistent, and supportive. We'd like to do more research about that. This particular program had a really strong trailblazer group, and my experience has been just on the actual program, but we'd like to do a bit more research with the employers. And I'm introducing the idea of job crafting because employers who actually looked at individual apprentices in that idea about job crafting, it was really, really helpful to get a personal fit for some of these aspects. So actions. Middlesex University actually has a new vision, and we're working toward that. In the chapter, I go more into how these ideas might actually fit in with sales tuition, because it does, if you look at the literature with sales tuition, it actually, there is a good match. But also, we asked some questions. As we said, the research was about, creating better practice, what people wanted. And we talked about workshop sessions, but on the right, you see some answers from the apprentices. They wanted more writing advice, face-to-face workshops, entrepreneurship studies, which is an interesting one, and more career-oriented resources. And we've actually been trying to provide some of those as we go. So we really have learned from doing this little bit of research. So new directions. Don't just go to the old models with technology. I've introduced one that I'm familiar with in the chapter. So we're not just digital natives anymore. We're visitors and residents, and that's the philosophy I use on digital. McCrindle calls Generation Y and Generation Z digital integrators. So we need to take that on board. They're doing their job. We need to do our job. We need to meet in the middle and really make a cohesive, collaborative program with our cohorts. Leadership is important. We could do more with that. We do some things with our program voice group, and even more could be done, and prepare for even more technology, even more seamlessness. That's my phone on the left. And yes, there are 15K Google, that's my Google account to have a look at. But generally, that's how I work. I work with mobile technology now. A postscript, we've just had a success that our first cohort has completed their EPA, and they did really well. They were actually the first cohort to go through the university EPA process. And in fact, I just wrote an email this week saying not only another congratulations for them, but also congratulating them on working together as a team to make sure that everybody did well. So just a really good note, very positive, more research to be done. Ran through this really quickly, but the chapter has a bit more details, and happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant, thank you. Perfect timing. Very well done. Thank you very much for that. So as before, I'd like to invite people to come and ask questions. If you want to turn your camera on, that'd be great, but certainly at least the microphone on. And rather than starting off with me again this time, I'd like to hand over to somebody else to ask a question. Do we have any initial takers? Brilliant. Oh, I can see a couple of familiar faces here. Anyone have anything they wanted to start off with? Oh, is that you, Mandy? Over to you.
That was brilliant. That was wonderful, Paula. Thank you so much. And it kind of ties with some research that I'm undertaking at the moment, which is an Erasmus Plus project. So no doubt I shall be looking at your chapter and probably coming into conversation with you at some point in the future. I'm really interested between the distinction between work-based and work-integrated learning. It feels as though the former is kind of falling out of fashion, particularly with the rise of integrated degree apprenticeships and the apprenticeship models that has changed so significantly in England over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. I mean, what's your view? I mean, you know, 5-10 years ago, it was all about work-based. Now it's about work integrated, or sort of learning integrated work, if you want to flip it some more. What's your view?
Well, and can I just, and I had to write this down, I'm experiencing something I would call COVID amnesia. When I go for words now, it's just, they're just not there. I'm writing down so much, but the University Vocational Award Council, UVAC, of course, has done so much. If people haven't gone to their website, please do. And Mandy does have a lot of work with them. I know I do, and Daryl Bravenbauer from Middlesex also. My view is that, well, work-based to me represents learners in the workplace. And as I said, I actually study lifelong learning. So my professional practice, or learning development, as I say to the students, because they clock sort of that area where I am, is about learners in the workplace. But generally, that doesn't necessarily include content. So as we said, Consalia are our sales specialists, but people are also learning how to do projects, but they need to have the content. So apprentices don't know this in the beginning. And other programs and other places do that. But that's an important distinction, I think. But the old terms, if you look at the old terms, like the Little and Brennan terms, you will find what we're doing today, albeit it's 20 years on. So we are doing some of the same aspects with employers, with learners, but apprentices do require us to work in a different way. Daryl Bravenbauer and I have these conversations about whether it is different. And yes, of course it is. But I think some of the properties you can get from the past studies, you know, you will see those. So I guess what I'm encouraging is that people look at what has gone on before in terms of those studies, what we've learned, because there are a lot of new practitioners, Mandy, and I think people are coming. So we have some, like my PhD research had to do with engineering, education, and health, because these are our champions with work-based learning. They've been doing it well, they've been doing it a long time. But a lot of new professions, and actually new professions, are coming into it. So they're saying, well, how do I work with learners in the workplace with my, you know, with my area? And there are some recipes out there. In fact, those are 3 good places, but nursing practice might be different than corporate practice or sales. So, you know, you do have to learn it afresh. So for me, it's a new iteration because of my background. And for a lot of people, it's a new territory.
Thanks, Paul.
I can see, Lisa, you have your hand up, so over to you.
Yep, Paula, that was fascinating. Thank you. A very quick question about leadership. I just wonder if there's a bit of a disconnect here between the ambitions of the sort of Gen Z, as you talk about, and actually what employers are looking for. Because I've read some research where employers say actually they're not looking for leaders in that early talent. They're looking for team members and followers. And I think there's some work there in kind of bringing the two together, because otherwise further down the chain you get the kind of accidental manager syndrome.
What a good question, because we actually have had that in our project. So we do a work-based project every year, and the last one's a little bit a larger one. But one of our employers who's been kind enough to actually give us some themes, some features, some aspects that they're looking for in the projects. And again, sales is at the heart of those. Was saying we're not looking for necessarily sales management. We're looking for a very good person working. However, I think team leadership is at the heart of that. So leadership on the different levels, or actually what they say about literature is it's not only that you're going to do a large scale study, but can you actually read literature that's done, like Stuart did, a large scale study to gain from it. So Generation Y and Generation Z, they're the ones who are saying, we do want to learn about leadership. But I think you're right. The employers, and the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that we have are about team leadership, taking responsibility for your job. Louise is here. She might, I'm looking at her, but I found it very fascinating. So people, the YZs, they want to talk about leadership. How can we talk about it then to mesh with what the employers are looking for? So you're exactly right.
Given opportunities, even if it's occasional, be given opportunities to lead.
Like
shadow boards that one of our organizations did. Yeah.
And I think as well, particularly in sales, sorry, is it okay to add to this? Have you got time?
Of course, yeah.
It's about giving them the skills, not necessarily leadership, but innovation and the skills to be able to challenge in the right way, with new ways to sell, with new ways to reach out to their customers. And as Paula said, to kind of develop groups of experts that can focus on social selling. So they might lead a project that says, what do our customers need in terms of that? So I wouldn't see it as leadership in the traditional sense, but leading initiatives and being innovative is a big part of what the program is doing. Yeah.
And this is a perfect thing to take up with employers, Lisa. So thank you for that. What is it that you are looking for? We've gotten it from, again, some volunteers from our employers, but it would be lovely to have that in a bit more representational sense.
Brilliant. Well, again, I'm conscious of time, and we seem to be having very good discussions after these papers. So I might again suggest that the coffee room is used towards the end to continue the conversation with Paula and perhaps Louise as well, since we've got somebody else from the program with us. So thank you very much for that. That was fantastic. Do we have any last minute urgent questions? If not, I'm going to hand over to Phoebe, Bonnie and Michelle. Brilliant. Okay. So I think, Bonnie, your presentation was being recorded anyway, so I'm going to leave the recording going because I know it's going to be very late by the time you're on again this evening here. And I'll hand over to you and your team to present your session.
Thank you. Now, just checking, can you see the full slide there?
Yep.
You can. Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's always really hard following such an energetic discussion because I feel bad because I want the conversation to continue. And I think that's because what I've really felt so far from watching the first two sessions is that there's a lot of energy and passion around quality education and tying that with enabling students to have these applications of their knowledge to practice. And I think that's a really exciting space to be in. So my name is Dr. Bonnie Dean and I am from the University of Wollongong, and I'm joined here by my co-authors, Associate Professor Michelle Eady, as well as Phoebe Rankin. So I'd love to just introduce the team to begin with, please. So Michelle and I work at the University of Wollongong, and we supervise Phoebe in an honours project. So while we're talking about Gen Y and Gen Z, we actually have a Gen Z right here in the space, and who was a co-author of this chapter, which is a real benefit, I think, which adds to the research itself. So thank you, Phoebe, for coming along as well. And Michelle, please feel free to chime into this presentation at any point, okay? Thank you. So Wollongong is about 1 hour south of Sydney, which is in New South Wales, Australia. And just before I go too far into this session, I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. So here where we sit in Wollongong, so Michelle, Phoebe and I are in Wollongong at the moment, and this is the land of the Wadi Wadi people, and this is the Dharawal Nation. So I'd love to acknowledge and pay my respects to these traditional custodians of land from which this knowledge and learning today is built upon. So what we're going to be doing in this next 20 minutes is talking about an empirical study that Phoebe led as part of her honours project. Before I go too much further as well, I should say that Phoebe has now finished her honours project and did extremely well, and is a professional primary school educator now. So Phoebe, I'm sure you've had a huge day in the classroom, so thanks so much for joining us this evening. As you might know, it's 7:30 at night right now in Australia. So in the University of Wollongong, I am a senior lecturer and curriculum manager. I'm a teaching and learning specialist inside a central unit, which focuses on curriculum design and teaching skills, but my passion truly lies in work integrated learning. And Michelle and I sit on the National Board of Directors for the National Work Integrated Learning Network, which is called ACEN. Michelle, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Bonnie. So I'm Michelle Eady, originally Canadian. I've been in Australia now since 2007. I work as an associate professor in the Faculty of Arts, Social Science and Humanities and the Department of Education, where we put about 240 students a year through our 4-year program in primary education. So that's the space that I work in. And I have to say that Bonnie has got me attached to this Will person. And we always say at the University of Wollongong, he must be really cute because everybody loves Will. And so, yeah, and so I'm on board with the loving Will. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks, Michelle. So let's dive straight into the research itself. And so look, this chapter talks about a study that brings together two main concepts. So work integrated learning, which we're really familiar with, and feedback. And our feedback, we know, is core to teaching and learning processes. And what we've noticed in the last few years is there has been a surge of feedback research, particularly around David Bowd and David Carlis's term, which was also a building on previous work, which is around feedback literacies. So acknowledging that students play a really active role in receiving, interpreting, managing, and acting on feedback. So this particular project looked at, well, what does feedback look like in subjects with work integrated learning? So when I say subjects, for you, that might mean like a unit, or perhaps it might mean a course. For us, it's the discrete item of study that sits within a larger degree program. So when I say subject, that's what I mean. That and we say subject coordinator as well as the term that we use for the educator that facilitates that subject. So the context within this is pre-service teacher education, and that is a 4-year degree, which Michelle was just telling us a little bit about. Michelle, do you want to tell us just a bit about the capacity of what the pre-service education teacher education degree looks like at UAW?
Yeah, so it's a 4-year degree for pre-service teachers to go through. Coming out of high school into the education program, there's a requirement that's set that's just recent over the past 4 years. The government has said that the students need to graduate from high school with 3 band 5s. A band 5 mark is over 85. And one of those grades need to be in English in order for our students to be face-to-face with children in schools. And if students want to come into education and don't have those kinds of marks, they need to show that they can complete a year of university successfully before they're allowed to have WIL placement opportunities. With every year of our course, there is a subject that contains a placement component of some kind. So that is a 2-week, a 3-week, a 4-week, or a 6-week block that the students are out learning how to be teachers in placements. But we do other WIL activities and learning opportunities throughout the degree as well. Students are taking a variety of subjects. Aboriginal education is one that maybe is not familiar with everyone that's here today. Maths, science, what we call health and physical development, so kind of our gym and health from a Canadian perspective. Yeah, and it's like we said, it's a 4-year degree with an opportunity to do an honors if that's something that people would like to do.
Thanks, Michelle. So let's go into the aims of this particular project. So we were interested in combining feedback and WIL. So what does feedback look like in subjects that contain WIL? So the aims of this particular research was, what are the current feedback practices in subjects that provide WIL opportunities within the Bachelor of Primary Education? And how does the design of these subjects support feedback literacy in subjects that provide WIL opportunities? So it's important that we understand the degree to which students feel supported to develop their feedback literacies, because we know that if students are able to action that feedback, then that's going to signal their growth and development and ideally lead to longer term employability skills and growth in knowledge as well. So the specifics of that is that this chapter explores the perceptions of students who are Gen Z, so those who are in their early 20s and late teens. Importantly, the feedback provider in this particular study was not the placement supervisor, or some in health context call it the clinical supervisor. What we're actually looking at in this particular study was the feedback that an educator, so those who facilitate those in credit-bearing subjects, their feedback to students. So what is the role of their feedback? How do they design feedback into the subject that also contains work integrated learning? Look, specifically, we were interested in students' perceptions of that feedback, how they receive that feedback in that particular subject. So let's just take a minute to look at feedback itself. So feedback is an essential element of teaching and learning. And look, feedback's been around for a long time, and there's so much, there's a humongous body of work, obviously. But we were looking specifically at feedback literacy, which was building on Carlos's and Bowd's 2018 paper, where they describe feedback literacy as understandings, capacities, and dispositions needed to make sense of information and to use it to enhance work or learning strategies. And they identify 4 areas. That is, students appreciating feedback, managing judgments, managing affect, and also taking action. And since they've published in 2018, there has been an inundation of studies looking at feedback literacy. So if you go to the Journal of Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education, all of a sudden all this empirical work is coming out. So when we did this study, it was in 2019, when this was still a very new concept, and the gap in the research at that stage was that there was a lack of empirical research and lack of student perceptions of feedback literacy. So in the sort of last 12 months or so, I've noticed that a lot more work, so people similar to us in very different contexts and in different studies have also picked up on this idea that we're looking at more empirical work on what feedback literacy actually looks like. And Bowden, David Bowden and Phil Dawson also just put out an article a couple of weeks ago around teachers' feedback literacy, again in the same journal, which is Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education, that then flips the coin and looks at the teacher's point of view. So let's now just take a look at WIL. So in the Australian concept, we use WIL as an umbrella term. So while we describe it as placements, we describe it as something much broader than that, which includes a range of activities that integrate work and learning. So at the University of Wollongong, Michelle and I have been involved in a project over the last 4 years now. collaborating with educators across the University of Wollongong and its campuses to come up with a consensus on what we define work integrated learning to be, and also how we might classify different types of work integrated learning so we're all talking about the same thing. So Michelle, why don't you share with us from an educator perception coming from primary education, your experience with work integrated learning?
Well, I think that many of us who work in teacher education know the importance of having students being placed in schools and being directly with teachers in the classroom and with students. And we've always done placement. I somehow feel like we're the godfathers of will. That's always been part of what we've done as teachers, is practice and be out in the field. But I never called it will. I was always calling it practicums or practice or placements or what have you. So we never really classified that as will. And I think another thing that we've done really well in education is having teachers involved in what it is that we're doing at uni, and having the community, the doors between the university and the community, the industry and the university open, so that we have that exchange of information and sharing between professionals and academics and students. Yeah, so that's the kind of things that we've done. We've just never had a name or a classification for it.
So at University of Wollongong, what we do have now is our own curriculum classification framework that has been embedded across our systems and the way that we actually communicate to students. And we can monitor, we can develop and scaffold and even report on work integrated learning across the university now, because we have this universal curriculum classification framework. So it identifies and classifies work integrated learning into 5 categories. So co-curricular will, so that's will not occurring within a credit-bearing subject. And then the other 4 are foundational will, embedded will, applied will, and professional will. So professional will is students spending long periods of time on placements with an industry or community partner. What we see in foundational, embedded, and applied will is not necessarily that elongated time on placement, but other industry or community related activities. And the difference between them is really the degree to which a student spends time practicing the discipline practices that they're actually learning within the degree itself. So you can see in foundational will, what we're calling those activities are those real building blocks, those reflective observations, those types of activities that will contribute to a development of work integrated learning literacies. So we have this up on our website, and it's also shown inside the chapter. But if you want to know more about this framework, Michelle and I would love to chat with you. So we used a case study methodology. What we did was we looked at, the degree goes across 4 years, and we selected one subject within each year to look at. We then selected students who had completed that subject. So for our 4th year subject, we actually went and tapped on the shoulder of a number of alumni students. So those who had completed the subject. So each subject had a work integrated learning activity within it. Phoebe ended up facilitating 15 focus groups. So we had a total of 34 student participants in this study. So here's a snapshot, and this is also in the chapter, so it'll be right there for you to go and have a look at. So as you can see up the top here, this is just the 4 subjects across the year, and down the bottom, this is the type of classification of will that they had, as well as the activities and assessments and structure of those particular subjects. But what we were interested in is students' perceptions of their feedback literacy and feedback literacy support within these subjects. So after these focus groups, what we ended up finding was that student perceptions of will really focused on relevance, and this is not surprising at all. So having the opportunity for students to apply what they know to real world settings was really, really important. But for those students who then were in other subject related activities, such as workshops and tutorials, which weren't work integrated learning, but sat within the same subject, we found that they found it beneficial because of the degree of relevance. So when students felt like the assessments and content of the subjects were linked directly to their teaching practice, which is their discipline, and then to their future careers, they were more inclined to find the feedback that they were given by their educator more valuable because they found it relevant. When we asked them about how did they receive support to develop their feedback literacy, we found that students articulated it in the assessment design. So the way that subjects were scaffolding their assessments so that one fed into the other. So you receive feedback on one assessment and that builds so that you're actually able to apply it in your second assessment. And look, this is fundamentally good teaching and learning practice in curriculum design. So it was great that we were able to find it here as well. Accessibility was something we found interesting. Was the students identified that actually being able to talk to the educator outside the parameters of the assessment, so actually engaging in a dialogue with them, being able to follow up with them on questions and clarify information was something that students found really beneficial that helps their feedback development. A third area that we thought would be more used, but actually wasn't, was the role of peers in providing feedback. So while we recognised it was actually quite underused in the 4 subjects that we looked at, those who were able to use peer feedback in the way assessments had been designed, they found that really, really supportive and really beneficial to their learning. So look, finally, the implications of this brings together work integrated learning and feedback, and we're really funneling it through this idea of relevance. And the idea of relevance is encouraging educators to make a link, a really explicit link in the feedback that they're providing to the students' future career practice. So not just to the assessment itself or the next assessment or to the will activity, but actually how does this feedback apply to how I'm going to use this content, knowledge and skills in the future. And I found this really interesting. At the moment, I've just spent a whole day marking my postgraduate students' assessments, and I can't stop thinking about this study. So in the feedback that I'm writing to them and the oral feedback that I'm recording for them through the Turnitin function, I keep on saying, so in practice, this is what it's going to look like, and here's why it's relevant to you. And here's why my feedback will help you become an even better practitioner. Phoebe or Michelle, before I wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Here's your moment, Phoebe.
You don't have to turn your camera on, that's okay.
I'd just like to say a big thank you for presenting the research so well, Bonnie and Michelle, and thank you for having us all here today. I think what you said sums it up so beautifully, and I'm certainly still seeing how relevant all of these things are in practice when I'm out in the field, how relevant it is to prac students that we have coming into schools. So yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, Phoebe, thank you so much for making it. It's such a treat to have you here. Thank you so much.
And bringing your cute koala picture that everyone can look at that's not yet. We've all been to the beach today, had a swim, just in case anyone's jealous of that. We'll just let you know that's happening before you start throwing difficult questions our way.
Well, it's a balmy 9 degrees in London, so yes, very jealous, and it's spring. But we'll leave that to one side and talk about your fantastic presentation. So thank you all very much for your time, really interesting. I know I had questions, but I wonder, again, does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to kick us off with? Michelle, I can't see if your hand is up or if you're, no, clapping, I see. I was like, I don't think she'd have a question about her own presentation, but you know, you never know. So if I kick us off then, I wonder, you mentioned students seeing the relevance of assessment or different activities to their future careers. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about how you help students see that relevance, because I certainly find that sometimes some of the tasks they do, it's not until a little bit later that they can see why we're asking them to do something in a particular way. So I wonder if you can comment a little bit on that.
Well, in this study, we elicited the perceptions of students rather than educators. So probably, Phoebe, are you able just to expand on when students talked about relevance, what was kind of the context that they were discussing that within?
Absolutely. In like according to the UOW framework, that applied and professional will is usually the opportunity where students can apply what they've learned throughout the degree. Certainly within teaching, a lot of it, I mean, the trajectory of your career is laid out for you. You know what field you're going into. So you can almost see the application of what you're learning already because you know it will be applicable. However, those tasks that were will oriented, so even in those lower levels of the scale, when the educator is explaining the link to how it's going to be applied within your career, and then when you go on to do the applied and professional will, you have the opportunity to see the relevance. And students certainly expressed feeling that it was more relevant to their learning, and therefore they were more willing to get feedback on that and take that on board and apply it to their own work. And yeah.
Can I mention something, Elizabeth, that I thought was really interesting from this study? Some of the students had gone through a subject that I had done, and in this subject, I have them create a plan for what they're going to do on their placement. And they take a look, they've taught a lesson at a school, they've had a friend record them, their peer has given them feedback, the teacher's given them feedback, and they're supposed to look at all of that and take a look at the professional teaching standards, create a plan for themselves moving forward, and then apply it, right? For 8 years, I've been doing this, yeah? And realized through Phoebe's study that the students don't use it when they get out into the field. Yeah. There's a disconnect between the students making these plans and actually applying them. And when Phoebe asked them, they said, oh, listen, that was just an assignment. That's not really anything important. So what I've started doing now is that as a result of this is attaching their plan to their learning management system. So when they get placed in the school and the teacher comes in, they can see that the student has made a plan. And in my introductory email to the teacher, I say, and by the way, the student has made a plan to try to get that conversation started. So it was really interesting to me all this time. I thought, oh yes, these students are using these plans, and they weren't doing that. But they started to now they're starting to see, oh yes, this is so relevant. Of course, this is more than just an assessment task. It's something that I need to apply.
Brilliant. Because I know certainly we find that sometimes getting students to reflect means they just write an assessment at the end where they pretend they've been reflecting consistently all term, but they just, yeah, so really interesting. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, I'll go over to, I better go to Nat and then I'll go to Paula.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting. And thank you for that framework and all of that. It's really fascinating. I was interested in if you could elaborate a bit more on the peer-to-peer feedback and your experience of this and what works, what doesn't work.
Go ahead, Phoebe.
Sorry. Yes, I think when it comes to peer feedback, we found that it was underused in a lot of subjects. It was something that educators intended to use with their students, but wasn't necessarily explicitly taught how to use peer feedback. But where it was used, and when students had informal discussions amongst one another about assessments, will-related assessments, they found that a really effective way to develop relevant learning and then go on to apply that in their teaching practice in the circumstances of the teaching degree.
And again, what was really interesting here, Nat, is that this subject, I took 240 students out of the uni and brought them into a local public school, knocked on the door of the principal, said, I'm bringing these, it's not a PECS, it's not a placement, but it's a will experience, but it's not a professional will, yeah? And I taught my lecture and a mini lecture, a tutorial, and then sent the students in pairs into the classroom to take a look for evidence of what we've just talked about in the lecture. And when COVID hit, it's been a great subject and students love it. We couldn't go into schools and I couldn't figure out what we were going to do. So what I ended up doing is going back to the students from the year before, asking if we could use the videos that they had taken of themselves, set up the current students in groups of 3 as if they were professional teachers working together in a strand coordination kind of way. And they had to watch their peer teaching from last year and give feedback and talk about what parts of the standards and things that they were meeting and how could this student make a plan for moving forward. So to try to switch the lens, and in that way, these three people were saying it was so helpful to work together in a group of peers, watching and giving feedback to someone else. So there's lots of different ways that we can do it. We just kind of have to put our creative thinking hats on and help them to see, then again, as teachers, as they go into their own classrooms, how important and valuable it is to have feedback from your peers. Yeah.
Thank you. Really
Brilliant.
interesting.
Paula, over to you.
Just a comment, really, the will diagram that you had from your uni is really interesting. Good to see. It was just what we were talking about, earlier, when you're trying to get that common ground in terms of the teaching or the facilitation, as we would call it, and seeing what those are, because I remember doing, I was in media department at one point, and I was asked not to do audit, but do a mapping of the work experiences. Yeah. And because of insurance, because of a lot of SMEs in creative industries, people don't always have work placements, but they have work experiences, the will. So I really appreciate that. And you guys have started that. It goes back to what Mandy was saying, how to define it. Just a quick question, really, though, and it's kind of based on that. I love this idea of linking that all together. Linking all the assessment together. Sorry, my screen just, there you go. Thank you. Yeah, I found that really helpful. I think you need to know the codes. And once you know the codes, you can say, well, this is where this experience is. I can see in different cohorts as well. You could be having different, as the presenters actually said, you don't always have to have a placement. You could have these different things. Just quick question, I know in education, and as with other things, your employer, is perhaps government based, so at public employer. And like the NHS here, you have, your employer, your also the people that you're working with, your professionals, and there's this could be an issue between this, consumer client, feeling when you work with your schools. I know you're professional, bodies, but do you ever find that there's some sort of a disconnect between, you talked about looking at that professional standards, for example, and then the policies of the school, and then the university teaching. So when you have your assessments, how do you bring those all together and then have those, workplace conversations?
Yeah.
To bring
so I'm just gonna, is it okay, Bonnie, if I jump in? Because I just feel so passionate about this. Okay, so first of all, Paula, thanks for your comments. That diagram, that's all Bonnie. And not only is it all Bonnie, but it's at the university now. We've built it from the ground up. So it's a common conversation. And what Bonnie and I had said in our other presentation earlier was that language now we're hearing at the uni. So we go to the coffee shop and we hear someone say, oh, are you doing embedded will or are you doing applied will? And we kind of poke each other and we get little goosebumps and go, they're talking. And now it's in our student handbook. So every single student, when they're looking, they see exactly what kind of will is happening in each subject. And they're starting to talk in that language as well. So while we need top-down support about enforcing this to happen and having it all approved from top down, we really need bottom up kind of grassroots people to actually be having that conversation and talking that language. We also created a really nice little mapping tool so that if you don't know what kind of will this is that you're doing in your subject, you just go through. Do you have students going here? Yes or no? Yes or no? This is happening? Yes or no? Oh, this is applied will. Oh, this is embedded will. Yeah, so it helps the staff realize what kind of will that it is. I think to the second part of your question, it's about relationships for me. Now, so me in teacher education, and it's just kind of the way that I am. And I realize now that it's probably a bit of a strength, but I try to bring the teachers on board with me in such a way so that those teachers, what I did was I created a small course that I had approved by our education department governing body. So that if the teachers at that school did that training with me, they got 6 hours towards their teacher accreditation hours that they need to upkeep their teaching, yeah? And at the same time, they're learning all about my subject. And not only were they helping create the subject, but I was giving them examples of past assessments, and we were all marking them in groups. And then all of a sudden I had 8 teachers on my marking team to help mark the subjects assessment tasks, right? So I was just trying to figure out ways that we could work together as a team. And now I go to staff events for that school, and retirement parties and birthday parties and baby showers and all the rest of it, just like I'm part of that staff because of the relationship over time that I've built. So the question in the other presentation from Trevor was, well, how do you manage this if it's a central body that's doing all of the placements? And this is where I really question whether a central body taking care of placements for engineering, teaching, nursing that can do what we're doing in education, which is really building those foundational relationships and treating each other reciprocally as professionals. So to me, it's all about that, the relationship and building that and sustaining that over time. And it makes it so much better for everyone. Yeah, but thanks for your question.
Brilliant. Thank you. That was a fantastic presentation as we're all in the stream. I think we better go back into the main room now. So I'll see you all there in a second, but thank you again.